What you're about to see, official science calls it an archaeological monument. But I'm going to be straight with you. This is not a monument. This is a place that someone very badly wanted to destroy. And they almost did. Almost, but not completely. And the traces that remain tell a story that has left serious engineers and geologists literally speechless. We're talking about Puma Punku, Bolivia, nearly 4,000 meters above sea level. A place where multi-ton blocks of one of the hardest stones on the planet were scattered as though it wasn't time and earthquakes that hit them, but something fundamentally different. Something the textbooks don't mention. Something academic science prefers to stay quiet about, because the moment you start asking the right questions, the entire official version falls apart right in front of you. Who built this, and how, when even today we cannot replicate the technology? Why does the destruction look like the result of a series of precise, directed strikes, and not natural forces? What was housed inside those mysterious blocks, and why is there absolutely nothing left inside them? And the biggest question of all, who wanted to destroy this site so thoroughly that no one could ever restore it? And why? The answers exist. They're uncomfortable. They don't fit what we were taught. But they are backed by physical facts, engineering analysis, and testimony that has existed for millennia. Only no one wanted to put it all together. Today, we put it together. Watch to the end, because toward the final minutes, there's a detail that no popular overview mentions. A detail that changes everything. I'm not exaggerating. You'll understand it yourself when we get there. Let's go. Picture a plateau nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, and what you find there should not exist. The Bolivian highlands. The air is thin enough that every step requires effort. The wind never stops. It cuts across your face and drives dust over a rocky wasteland where there are no trees, no shelter, no sign that life ever flourished here. And it is precisely in this place, at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, that the wreckage known as Puma Punku lies scattered across the earth. The first thing you feel when you see it is not awe. It is confusion. Because what stands before you is not majestic columns or temple walls or enigmatic statues. What stands before you is chaos. Enormous stone blocks thrown across the plateau as though some colossal force swept them off a table and let them fall wherever they landed. Some lie on their sides. Some are overturned. Some have split along fracture lines, so straight, so clean that no natural process can account for them. This refers to blocks of andesite and red sandstone that once formed a unified architectural complex and now look like wreckage from an industrial explosion. But here is where the real provocation begins. Among all this chaos, if you step closer, if you look carefully, you start to notice details that do not fit any story about primitive builders working with stone tools. The surfaces of the blocks are polished to a mirror finish. The grooves are cut with a precision that a modern milling machine would struggle to replicate. The holes are drilled at perfect right angles without the slightest deviation. And all of this, in stone, with a hardness of 7 on the Mohs scale, still considered one of the most difficult materials for mechanical processing today. This refers not to 1 or 2 decorative elements, but to hundreds of fragments scattered across an area of several hectares. Each one is evidence of industrial production, not handcraft. Each one is a question without an answer. Official science offers its version. The builders of the Tiwanaku culture erected this complex around the 6th century of the Common Era, using primitive tools of bronze and stone, wooden sledges, and human muscle. But this version collapses against one simple fact. The nearest quarry from which the andesite blocks were transported lies nearly 90 kilometers away, and the blocks weigh between 100 and 440 tons. No sledge in human history has moved such loads across mountain terrain over such distances. No technology known to that era allowed stone to be worked with this level of precision. And so you stand on this wind-battered plateau, looking at the wreckage of something that was clearly immense, and you understand that what lies before you is not simply ruins. What lies before you is the scene of a catastrophe. A place where something was destroyed deliberately, methodically, and with such force that no one ever rebuilt it. Or no one wanted to. Or there was no one left who could. There are questions that archaeology prefers not to ask out loud, not because the answers do not exist, but because any honest answer destroys too much of what is considered established fact. The question of Puma Punku is exactly that kind of question. And it is devastatingly simple. What exactly happened here, and what exactly was used to do it? Let us start with what is visible to the naked eye. Blocks of andesite, a rock with a hardness of 7 on the Mohs scale, impervious to bronze chisels or copper tools, are scattered across an area of several hectares. But the issue is not the scatter itself. The issue is the nature of that scatter. Geologists who have worked at this site consistently report the same pattern. The blocks do not lie where a landslide or a seismic tremor would have displaced them. They lie as though each one received an individual impulse, directed, precise, and of extraordinary force. This refers to fragments ranging from several tons to blocks exceeding 100 tons in mass, found dozens of meters from their presumed original positions. Now for the details that official reports prefer to leave unaddressed. Several large blocks have been found in positions that cannot be explained by erosion or seismic activity under any physical model. They rest on top of soil layers that, by every principle of geology, should lie above them, not below them. This means one thing. At the moment of destruction, these blocks were hurled upward with enough force that when they fell, they landed on the surface of later sediment deposits. Consider what magnitude of impact would be required for a multi-ton stone slab to be launched into the air, overturn, and come to rest not in its original place, but beside it and upside down. This refers specifically to the eastern section of the complex, where a multi-ton slab has been documented standing at a 45-degree angle to the horizontal. No known geological process tilts monoliths at such an angle, unless the mechanism is a shock wave. Engineers and builders who have studied this fragment say it plainly. The position of the slab is consistent with a sharp vertical impulse from below, which lifted it and locked it in its inclined position at the moment when the ground had not yet settled back into place. But the most inexplicable element is not the position of the blocks. It is the character of their fractures. Andesite does not crumble or crack from temperature fluctuations the way sedimentary rock does. It does not delaminate under the action of water. To split an andesite block requires a colossal mechanical force, directed and concentrated at a single point. That is precisely what the fractures at Puma Punku look like. Clean, localized, with a sharp fracture line that does not follow the natural fissures of the rock, but cuts straight through, exactly as in an industrial explosion with a shaped charge. Some researchers compare this picture to the effects of cumulative charges, munitions that focus the energy of an explosion into a narrow cone and penetrate even armored steel. No one is claiming that such weapons existed in antiquity, but no one has been able to explain what natural or primitive mechanical process produces an identical result in stone of 7-point hardness. And this is where the central question emerges, the one researchers have been asking for decades, and to which academic science has yet to provide a coherent answer. What destroyed Puma Punku? What force scattered 100-ton blocks across dozens of meters, split andesite along straight lines, launched monoliths high enough that they overturned in the air, and drove some of them into the ground with enough energy that they ended up below later sediment layers? An earthquake? No. Seismic waves do not produce directed scatter and do not fracture hard rock along straight lines. A volcanic eruption? No. The nearest volcano is at a distance incompatible with this level of precision damage. Time and erosion? No. Andesite does not disintegrate this way over millennia. What remains is a question that sounds uncomfortable but follows an unimpeachable logic. What if this was a strike? Directed, precise, of incredible force, aimed at a site that someone very badly wanted to destroy. Puma Punku does not stand in isolation. 2 kilometers away lies Tiwanaku, a city that official science has still not been able to date with confidence, explain convincingly, or fit into any known civilizational framework. This is not a village or a settlement. By the scale of what survives, it was a metropolis, with monumental gateways, stepped pyramids, canals, and plazas designed for tens of thousands of people. And this city stands at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, in a zone where the average annual temperature barely exceeds 0 degrees Celsius, and the agricultural season lasts no more than 4 months a year. By every logic of survival, nothing larger than a hunting camp should have existed here. And yet Tiwanaku existed. Not merely existed, it dominated the region for centuries, possibly millennia. This refers to a territory that today encompasses western Bolivia, southern Peru, and northern Chile, one of the largest spheres of influence in the history of pre-Columbian America. And yet, no evidence of the gradual development of this civilization has ever been found. It did not grow from primitive settlements. It appeared already fully formed, as though it had been transplanted here in a finished state. This is precisely what leads researchers to speak of Tiwanaku as a possible heir to a far older and far more sophisticated culture, one whose traces we have not yet found, or may never find. Puma Punku occupies a special position in this context. If Tiwanaku is a city, then Puma Punku is something fundamentally different in purpose and in the technology of its construction. The level of stoneworking here exceeds by an order of magnitude everything found in Tiwanaku itself. The precision of the grooves, the geometry of the drill holes, the quality of the polished surfaces, all of this indicates that Puma Punku was built to different standards, by different methods, and in all likelihood for a different purpose. This refers to structural elements that engineers describe as clearly functional rather than decorative. Standardized dimensions, interchangeable components, a modular assembly principle. Now for what makes this picture truly explosive. The age of Tiwanaku is the subject of fierce debates that academic science prefers to conduct quietly, without unnecessary publicity. The official dating places it at approximately 500 to 900 years of the Common Era. But the Bolivian engineer and researcher Arthur Poznansky, who devoted more than 40 years to studying Tiwanaku, reached a conclusion based on the astronomical alignments of the complex. The age of the city is no less than 15,000 years. His calculations were reviewed by the German Astronomical Society in 1926 and partially confirmed. This means that if Poznański is even approximately correct, Tiwanaku and Puma Punku existed before the end of the last glacial period, in an era when, according to mainstream understanding, there was not a single advanced civilization anywhere on the planet. Official science responds to this data predictably. Poznański's conclusions are declared outdated, the astronomical dating method is called unreliable, and the question of age is treated as closed. But closing a question and answering it are two different things, because the physical evidence has not gone anywhere. The blocks stand where they stand. The grooves have preserved their precision. And the central question, how people of the Neolithic or even the early Bronze Age created objects that exceed the capabilities of modern mechanical engineering, continues to hang in the air without an answer. What matters even more is this. Even accepting the official dating of the 6th to 9th century of the Common Era, the technology of Puma Punku still has no explanation. Because in the 6th century of the Common Era, no stone-working machinery existed anywhere on the planet. No technology existed that could drill a perfectly perpendicular hole in andesite. No engineering culture of modular construction with standardized components existed anywhere. And nowhere, not in Egypt, not in Mesopotamia, not in China, were blocks exceeding 100 tons in weight transported dozens of kilometers across mountain terrain. Nowhere except here. That is why Puma Punku cannot be studied in isolation from Tiwanaku, and Tiwanaku cannot be understood without acknowledging the obvious. What we are looking at are the remnants of a civilization that operated by rules still unknown to us. And that civilization disappeared, rapidly, completely, and with no apparent effort to preserve anything of what it had built. The debate over the age of Puma Punku has been running for a long time, loudly, and without any visible resolution. Some researchers insist on the 6th century before the Common Era. Others cite figures ranging from 12 to 17,000 years. Still others speak of a period preceding the end of the last glacial maximum, a time when much of the northern hemisphere lay under an ice sheet and the very concept of civilization did not yet exist in official history. This debate matters, but it diverts attention from a question that is far more uncomfortable and far more specific. Not when this was built, but exactly how it was built, and why it still cannot be replicated today. Start with a basic fact that no one disputes. The primary building material of Puma Punku is andesite. This is a volcanic rock with a hardness of 6 to 7 on the Mohs scale. For comparison, the hardness of steel is 4 to 4.5. This means that andesite is harder than most of the metal tools with which ancient builders supposedly worked it. A bronze chisel on andesite will leave nothing but a scratch. A copper tool will blunt before it penetrates the rock by a single millimeter. And yet the surfaces of the Puma Punku blocks are polished to the point of reflecting light. This refers not to isolated decorative panels, but to load-bearing structural elements weighing from several to hundreds of tons, components that by their nature require no decorative finishing and yet have it. Now for the grooves. Cut into many of the blocks are rectangular channels, perfectly straight, with corners at precisely 90 degrees, without the slightest rounding at the junction of the walls. In modern manufacturing, this profile is called a rectangular slot and is produced by an end mill on a computer numerically controlled machine. By hand, using any abrasive or percussive tool, Achieving a perfectly square internal corner in hard stone is physically impossible. Abrasives round the edges, impacts cause chipping, and any hand motion introduces deviation. This refers to specific specimens examined by American engineers during independent expeditions, and each time the conclusion was the same. This result requires a rotating tool with a rigid axis and mechanical drive. The drill holes in the blocks are a separate matter entirely. They are bored perfectly perpendicular to the surface, with a constant diameter along their full depth, and without the helical entry marks characteristic of hand drilling. The diameter of the holes in different blocks matches to within tenths of a millimeter, meaning that a standardized tool was used, not one fashioned by hand for a specific task. The interior walls of the holes are polished to the same degree as the outer surfaces of the blocks. No known technology of the Stone or Bronze Age simultaneously achieves perpendicularity, constant diameter, and a polished interior wall in rock of 6 to 7 point hardness. There is one more element that engineers consistently describe as the most telling. On a number of blocks, evidence has been found of what specialists call contour milling, where a tool follows a defined curve, removing material to a precisely defined depth along the entire length of the path. The result of this process is a smooth, uniform relief with no steps, no impact marks, and no deviation from the intended profile. In modern production, this is achieved on 3- or 4-axis CNC milling machines. In manual production, it is not achieved at all, regardless of the skill of the craftsman or the amount of time invested. This refers to decorative elements on the facade slabs of Puma Punku, photographed, measured, and analyzed by specialists in industrial materials processing, who invariably reached one conclusion: these are the marks of machine work. And here arises the question that official science formulates as cautiously as possible, while independent researchers formulate it as directly as possible. If the level of stoneworking at Puma Punku corresponds to the capabilities of modern mechanical engineering, then either those capabilities existed in antiquity, or the site was not built in antiquity. There is no third option. And official science is not prepared to publicly acknowledge either of those two options, because each one overturns the version of history on which the entire academic tradition of the past 200 years is founded. The date of construction ceases to be the decisive question. It does not matter whether this was the 6th century of the Common Era or 12,000 years ago. What matters is one thing. In either of those eras, the technology that left its marks on the stones of Puma Punku should not have existed. But it did, and its traces are right there. You can reach out and touch them today. If these structures had been discovered on the grounds of a modern industrial facility, no one would have asked a single unnecessary question. Standardized blocks with identical mounting grooves, uniform fastener holes, modular sections that mate without gaps and can be swapped out without adjustment. This is the vocabulary of modern engineering, the language of production logistics, the principle underlying every piece of serial equipment from aircraft engines to industrial reactors. But none of this was found in a 21st century factory. All of it was found on a Bolivian plateau, in the ruins of a site that official science refuses to even acknowledge as a technological structure. Modularity is not a decorative device, and not a coincidence of dimensions. It is an engineering decision made consciously, and only in one circumstance, when components must be interchangeable. Interchangeability is required when a system anticipates maintenance, component replacement, or scaling. No builder of a ritual temple in all of human history ever incorporated the principle of interchangeability into a structure, because a temple does not need technical servicing. It needs monumentality, symmetry, and durability, not the ability to replace a block quickly without dismantling an entire section. That is precisely the principle embedded in Puma Punku, and precisely the one that defies explanation within the framework of a ritual structure. This refers above all to the so-called H blocks, one of the most recognized and most debated elements of the complex. Their form has no parallel in the architecture of any known ancient culture. Not in Egypt, not in Mesopotamia, not in China, not in Central America. An H-shaped cross-section means the block has two parallel load-bearing uprights and a crosspiece between them, exactly like a standard equipment rack in modern electronic or military hardware. Into such a rack, standard form factor equipment is inserted: a power supply unit, a computing module, a communications node. The rack holds the equipment, secures it in position, and allows any element to be removed and replaced without dismantling the rest. That is exactly what the H blocks of Puma Punku look like, and exactly how engineers describe them when seeing them for the first time, without knowing in advance that they are looking at an ancient archaeological monument. The dimensions of the recesses in the H blocks repeat with a precision that excludes coincidence. Measurements taken by independent researchers show variation in interior dimensions of 2 to 3 millimeters between blocks located dozens of meters apart from one another. This is a standard manufacturing tolerance, not hand-fitting on site, but production to a single template or technical drawing. This refers to a series of several dozen surviving H blocks scattered across the entire area of the complex, and every one of them displays the same interior dimensions with the same tolerances. Now for what follows from this fact. If one looks at it honestly, without the desire to preserve academic consensus, manufacturing interchangeable components to a single standard requires at minimum three things: a precise measuring instrument, a unified system of measurement, and centralized production with quality control. In the 6th century of the Common Era, none of these existed anywhere on the planet, in a form that would have ensured 2 to 3 millimeter precision when working with andesite. The micrometer appeared in the 19th century. The international system of units was established in the 20th. Industrial quality control of stone components has never existed, for the simple reason that no one has ever produced stone parts in series with millimeter range tolerances. Beyond the H blocks, Puma Punku contains elements with interlocking joints, dovetail-type grooves that lock components together without mortar or fasteners. This type of joint is used in modern woodworking and metalworking precisely because it provides rigid resistance to lateral loads and allows disassembly without destruction of the component. In stone, and especially in andesite, this joint cannot be produced with a chisel or abrasive, only with a rotating tool under rigid control of depth and milling angle. And yet here it is. The totality of this evidence leads to a conclusion that engineers state cautiously but unambiguously. What we are looking at is not architecture. It is a production system, not a temple, not a memorial, not a ritual space, but a structure designed for the placement, securing, and replacement of standardized equipment. What that equipment actually was remains an open question. But that the design of Puma Punku was built around equipment rather than around worship, that is a conclusion that follows directly from the physical characteristics of the blocks. And it is a conclusion that official science does not know what to do with. The H blocks of Puma Punku are known to anyone who has ever seriously engaged with this subject. They are photographed, measured, debated, and cited in dozens of publications, and yet official science has still not provided any coherent functional explanation for them. Ritual purpose? Decorative element? Structural component of a temple facade? None of these versions explains the central issue. Why would a builder constructing a ceremonial structure need a form that does not occur in nature, has never been used in the architecture of any other known civilization, and was reproduced dozens of times with a tolerance of 2 to 3 millimeters? The H-shaped profile is not an architectural form. It is a mechanical engineering form. Two vertical elements connected by a horizontal crosspiece create a load-bearing frame with open lateral recesses. Exactly what is needed when equipment must be secured on two sides, accessible from front and back, and capable of being quickly removed when necessary. This refers to a structural principle that was independently rediscovered by military engineers in the 20th century and became known as rack mounting. The 19-inch standard, the universal mounting frame for electronic equipment used today by every military in the world, in server rooms, aboard ships, and in aircraft, is built on precisely this principle. Two vertical rails with fastener holes into which equipment of standard width is inserted. Nothing superfluous, maximum functionality with minimum material. Now take a photograph of an H-block from Puma Punku and place it alongside a diagram of a standard 19-inch rack. The principle is identical. The vertical uprights are load-bearing. The crosspiece provides fixation. The recesses accommodate modules. The recess dimensions are standardized. The only difference is the material. Steel and aluminium there, andesite here. But the functional logic is the same. This is not a speculative comparison. American researcher Arthur Poznansky and later engineer Jim Allison, who studied Puma Punku from an industrial design perspective, independently reached the same conclusion. The H-blocks could not have been architectural elements. Their form is functionally excessive for construction and functionally optimal for housing equipment. More specifically, the recesses in the blocks have a depth sufficient to accommodate objects between 15 and 25 centimeters thick, and a width that corresponds in dimension to a range of standard modern equipment modules. This refers to measurements conducted by several independent groups and which produce the same results regardless of who conducts them or for what purpose. The military dimension of this story deserves particular attention. In modern armed forces, rack mounting is applied precisely where equipment must function under extreme conditions, withstanding vibration, impact, and shock loads, remaining accessible for rapid field replacement, and staying rigidly secured in its normal position. The onboard electronics of combat aircraft, the navigation systems of warships, the command modules of armored vehicles, all of it is rack-mounted precisely because the rack simultaneously solves several problems: fixation, protection, accessibility, and interchangeability. The H-shaped andesite block solves the same problems, only in a material that withstands not merely vibration and impact, but direct mechanical force of enormous magnitude. Andesite does not deform. It does not melt at high temperatures. Its melting point exceeds 1000 degrees Celsius. It does not degrade under chemically aggressive environments. If someone were designing a protective housing for equipment intended to operate under conditions of extreme physical stress, andesite would be a near-ideal choice. Here arises a question that is being asked with increasing frequency. What exactly was housed in these recesses? There is no answer. because nothing has been found inside them. Absolutely nothing. No traces of metal, no organic residue, no ceramic fragments, no tools, no ritual objects. The recesses of the H-blocks of Puma Punku contain only emptiness. And that emptiness speaks to two things simultaneously. Either the contents were deliberately removed by someone who knew exactly what was there and why it needed to be taken, or the contents were destroyed along with the structure itself in the course of whatever catastrophe produced the destruction patterns we observe. The second possibility implies that the strike was precise enough to destroy the contents of the recesses without completely obliterating the andesite housings themselves. This refers to the logic of targeted rather than total destruction, exactly the logic that governs modern precision weapons when neutralizing enemy infrastructure. One further fact deserves mention, rarely cited in popular overviews. Among the ruins of Puma Punku, traces of metal clamps have been found, or rather, traces of where they once were. At the joints between blocks, channels have been identified with a characteristic shape, widening toward the center, with smooth walls and a flat base. Channels of precisely this profile are used for pouring dovetail-type metal clamps that permanently lock two blocks together, preventing any displacement under load. The metal itself did not survive. Either it was removed or it melted under extreme heat. But the shape of the channel survived. And it indicates that the construction of Puma Punku incorporated metal fasteners, meaning that its builders not only worked andesite to machine precision, but also practiced metallurgy at a level that official history does not attribute to any civilization of that era. When a geologist or structural engineer visits Puma Punku for the first time, not as a tourist, but as a specialist with a trained eye for the mechanics of destruction, the initial reaction is almost always the same. Not wonder at the antiquity, not awe at the scale, but professional bewilderment in the face of a pattern that does not conform to any known model of natural destruction. Geologists who have worked at this site consistently report the same finding. What they observe does not correspond to an earthquake, a landslide, erosion, or volcanic activity. What they observe corresponds to an explosion, a series of explosions, directed, localized, and of extraordinary force. Begin with the ground itself. At several points across the complex, the surface layer of soil is buckled, lifted from below, and deformed in the precise manner that occurs when a shock wave passes through relatively soft material. This is not the result of freeze-thaw cycling. Freezing produces a different deformation pattern, uniform and shallow. This is not the result of root activity. At this altitude and in this climate, root systems do not develop the pressure required to heave soil upward. The buckling at Puma Punku, localized, uneven, directed upward from below, corresponds specifically to the action of a shock wave propagating from a point of detonation through the ground to the surface. This refers to zones located in immediate proximity to the largest concentrations of shattered blocks. That is, precisely where the logic of an explosion would predict the greatest concentration of energy. Now for the slab on the eastern slope. This is one of the most thoroughly documented and most frequently cited physical phenomena at the entire complex. A multi-ton monolith stands at a 45-degree angle to the horizontal, not lying, not leaning against another stone, but standing, driven vertically into the ground at an incline. No known geological process produces this result. An earthquake topples, displaces or buries, but does not place a monolith at a 45-degree angle with this precision. A landslide carries material down slope, but does not arrest it at a fixed angle at the point of rest. Volcanic ejection is neither selective nor precise. The only physical process that explains exactly this position of a monolith is a vertical impulse from below, sharp, brief, and of extreme force, which lifted the slab and locked it in its inclined position at the moment when the surrounding ground had not yet had time to settle back. This is precisely how objects behave in the zone of a subsurface explosion, not at the surface, but from some depth, when the shock wave travels upward and expels whatever lies above the epicenter. The scatter pattern of the blocks is the third argument that specialists describe as the most difficult to refute. In an earthquake, large objects are displaced predominantly in the horizontal plane and over relatively short distances determined by terrain. In a landslide, they move down slope in the general direction of flow. At Puma Punku, the pattern is fundamentally different. Blocks are scattered radially from several points, over distances ranging from several to dozens of meters, in multiple directions simultaneously, with a portion of them found in an inverted position. An inverted block weighing several dozen tons is a physically impossible outcome for any natural process except one: explosive ejection, in which the object receives a vertical component of impulse sufficient to lift it and cause it to overturn in flight. This refers to specific blocks in the northwestern and eastern sectors of the complex, documented in inverted positions resting on top of more recent soil deposits. There is one further observation that geologists mention less frequently, perhaps precisely because it sounds too specific to be comfortable. On a number of blocks, traces of thermal impact have been identified, areas of surface vitrification that form under brief exposure to temperatures exceeding 800 to 900 degrees Celsius. Andesite does not vitrify from prolonged heating. What is required is precisely a brief, intense thermal pulse. Such a pulse is generated by a thermobaric explosion, by the action of a directed thermal beam, or by the detonation of a material with a high combustion temperature in immediate proximity to the stone surface. None of these heat sources was available to the builders of the era that official science assigns to Puma Punku. But the traces of that heat are still there. The totality of this evidence, buckled ground, a monolith at 45 degrees, radial scatter of inverted blocks, traces of thermal vitrification, forms a picture that geologists and demolition engineers describe in identical terms. These are the consequences of a series of directed explosions delivered against specific points of the structure with the aim of its functional destruction. Not accidental damage, deliberate elimination. Methodical, precise, and sufficiently powerful to preclude any possibility of restoration. This is exactly what installations look like after the application of precision munitions. This is exactly what infrastructure looks like after a targeted strike whose purpose was not merely to damage, but to permanently disable. One may argue about the nature of the weapon. One may argue about who used it and against whom. But the character of the destruction itself is not a matter for argument, because stone does not lie. The andesite blocks of Puma Punku preserve the physical record of an event that fits no natural model. And the longer professionals study that record, the more insistently one conclusion emerges. Something here was detonated, deliberately, with a precision that is difficult to dismiss. Science has long been accustomed to treating myths with condescension. A legend is not a source, it is folklore, the collective imagination of a people who lacked writing and explained the incomprehensible through images of gods and catastrophes. This is precisely how academic tradition has dismissed the traditions of the Andean peoples for decades, politely but definitively. There is, however, one problem with this approach. When the legends of different peoples, separated by thousands of kilometers and centuries of history, describe the same event with the same details, that is no longer folklore, that is testimony. Possibly transmitted many times over, distorted by time and retelling, but testimony nonetheless. The traditions of the Aymara and Quechua peoples, who live along the shores of Lake Titicaca and on the Bolivian plateau, contain a description of an event they name differently in different versions, but always with the same core. At some moment in ancient history, a great city was destroyed in an instant. Not conquered, not abandoned, not gradually dismantled, but destroyed, suddenly and with such force that nothing remained of it but rubble. This city was the capital or residence of a being the traditions call Viracocha, a creator who came from the other side, taught people, gave them knowledge and laws, and then departed, or was compelled to depart. This refers to traditions recorded by Spanish chroniclers in the 16th and 17th centuries, specifically by Pedro Cieza de León and Juan de Betanzos, who documented the accounts of indigenous informants before colonial censorship had time to systematically distort them. Viracocha in Andean mythology is a figure of a fundamentally different order than a typical tribal deity. He is described as a being of great height, light-skinned, with a beard, that is, with features atypical for the indigenous population of the Andes. He came from Lake Titicaca, or, in other versions, descended from the sky. He created the sun, the moon, and the stars. He shaped humans from stone and breathed life into them. He built cities, and it is his constructions to which the traditions attribute a perfection that defies explanation within the framework of ordinary human technology. And then something occurred that the traditions describe as a catastrophe of universal scale. Fire from the sky, earth that trembled and opened, water that rose and covered everything, and the city of Viracocha disappeared. Not gradually, not beneath the weight of centuries, but in an instant, so that all that remained of the great structure was scattered stones. It is precisely this description, fire from the sky, instantaneous destruction, scattered stones, that makes the Andean legends so uncomfortable for official science. Because the physical picture they paint corresponds exactly to what geologists and engineers document at the site of Puma Punku today. Buckled ground, a consequence of shockwave propagation. Monoliths standing at 45-degree angles, a consequence of a vertical impulse from below. Blocks scattered radially across dozens of meters, a consequence of a series of directed explosions. And a legend about fire from the sky, after which a great city became a field of scattered stones. Coincidence? Perhaps. But coincidences of this level of specificity are not normally dismissed by science, unless they happen to concern Puma Punku. There is another layer of tradition that deserves separate attention. In many versions of the Viracocha myth, a motif of confrontation appears. A war or conflict between Viracocha and other beings that the traditions name variously: evil gods, hostile forces, adversaries from another world. It is as a result of this conflict that Viracocha either departs from the earth, or suffers defeat, or sees his city destroyed. This refers to variants of the myth recorded across different regions of the Andes, from Tiwanaku to the Pacific coast, and in all of them, the catastrophe is not natural in character, but conflictual. Not a natural disaster, but the outcome of a confrontation, not an accident, but a deliberate act of destruction. The parallels with other mythological systems here are not coincidental. Sumerian texts describe wars among the gods. The Anunnaki fought with weapons so destructive that entire cities were reduced to ash in a single night. The Indian Vedas contain descriptions of weapons that modern researchers compare to thermonuclear devices. A blinding flash, incinerating heat, a blast wave after which survivors lost their hair and nails. The Avesta describes a war among heavenly forces whose result was a change in climate and the destruction of an entire civilization. Everywhere the same structure appears: a highly developed civilization, a conflict involving weapons of monstrous power, an instantaneous catastrophe, and after it, only ruins and legends. This refers to texts separated by thousands of kilometers and written in languages that had no contact with one another, yet describing events with a structural similarity that is difficult to dismiss. The Andean traditions about Viracocha stand in this sequence not as an exotic exception, but as one more link in a chain that extends across the entirety of ancient human history. And the more carefully one studies that chain, the more clearly one pattern emerges. Somewhere in the depths of the past, something occurred that simultaneously severed the development of several advanced civilizations. Something so vast and so destructive that the memory of it was preserved in the legends of every people on Earth, even though the events themselves have long passed beyond what academic history is prepared to accept as real. Puma Punku in this context is not simply an archaeological site. It is a possible location of one of those events, a place where legend and physical evidence coincide so precisely that ignoring the coincidence becomes increasingly difficult. The stones are scattered exactly as the tradition describes. The destruction is directed, as in the myth of the war among gods, and no one ever returned to rebuild what was destroyed here. Not Viracocha, not anyone else. The word fantastic is the favorite shield of academic science. When a hypothesis does not fit the accepted paradigm, it is not refuted on its merits. It is called fantastic, speculative, unscientific. And on that note, the conversation ends. This is precisely how the idea that Puma Punku was not a temple, but a technical installation destroyed by a deliberate strike has been treated for decades. Fantasy, conspiracy theory, pseudoscience. But there is one problem with that label. It does not cancel physical facts, and the facts are there, and they do not diminish simply because science prefers not to look at them. The version of a technical strike is not built on speculation or the desire for sensation. It rests on 4 independent bodies of evidence, each of which already demands explanation on its own. Together they form a picture that is difficult to interpret as anything other than the remnants of a conflict, large-scale, highly technological, and final. First, the site is structured as technical infrastructure, not as a ceremonial complex. This is not an evaluative judgment. It is the conclusion independently reached by engineers, industrial designers, and military technicians when they encounter for the first time the H-blocks, the dovetail interlocking joints, the standardized mounting grooves, and the traces of metal fasteners. Not one of these elements has any functional meaning in the context of ritual architecture. Every one of them has direct analogues in modern systems for housing and protecting equipment. Temples are not designed to tolerances of 2 millimeters. Temples are not fitted with interchangeable modular sections. Temples are not fastened with metal clamps poured into channels calculated for dynamic loads. This refers to engineering solutions that in modern practice are applied exclusively where equipment must operate under mechanical stress, vibration, or shock loading. That is precisely what Puma Punku is, and precisely what makes it unlike any temple found anywhere on the planet. Second, the destruction is not natural, it is directed. This conclusion does not belong to alternative researchers. It belongs to geologists and demolition engineers who have analyzed the site from a professional standpoint. Buckled ground at the points of maximum destruction, a monolith standing at 45 degrees, a physically impossible result of either an earthquake or a landslide. Radial scatter of blocks from several epicenters. Overturned monoliths weighing dozens of tons, resting on top of more recent soil layers. Traces of thermal vitrification on andesite surfaces. Each of these indicators individually may prompt debate. Together, they form a signature that demolition specialists recognize immediately. A series of directed detonations had pre-selected points of the structure. This refers to the same logic that military engineers apply when destroying strategic enemy infrastructure. Not the total obliteration of an area, but the precision elimination of key nodes, after which restoration of the facility becomes impossible. Third, the technological level of the construction corresponds to no known civilization of that era, and moreover exceeds the capabilities of a significant portion of modern construction technology. Machine processing of andesite to sub-millimeter precision. Perpendicular drilling of standard diameter holes in rock of 7-point Mohs hardness. Contour milling with uniform material removal along a defined curve. Transportation of blocks weighing between 100 and 440 tons over nearly 90 kilometers of mountain terrain. Production of interchangeable components to 2 to 3 millimeter tolerances without a unified system of measurement and without precision instruments that were not invented until the 19th century. This refers not to isolated, remarkable details, but to a systemic technological level that permeates the entire site from foundation to fastening elements. Such a level is not achieved by accident and is not transmitted through oral tradition. It requires an engineering school, a production base, and a quality control system. Everything that official history does not allow for the era to which it assigns Puma Punku. Fourth, and this is the most uncomfortable argument of all, no one ever attempted to restore Puma Punku. Not at all, not partially, not symbolically. The peoples who lived beside this place for millennia, the Aymara, the Quechua, the predecessors of the Inca, made not the slightest attempt to return even a single block to its position. The Inca, who created one of the most powerful construction empires in the history of the Americas, passed it by. Spanish colonizers, who quarried stone for their buildings across Bolivia, did not touch Puma Punku, not because they preserved it, but because the scattered blocks resisted any coherent logic of use. This refers to a site that across its entire existence in a ruined state attracted not a single restoration attempt, while Tiwanaku, located 2 kilometers away, was repeatedly used as a quarry. What does this mean? Only one of two things. Either those who built Puma Punku disappeared entirely with the catastrophe that destroyed it, and no one remained who knew what had stood here or why it needed to be rebuilt. Or those who survived knew that restoration was impossible because it required technology they no longer possessed. Both possibilities point to the same conclusion. The catastrophe that struck Puma Punku did not destroy only a building, it destroyed the civilization that built it. Along with all of its knowledge, its tools, its production base, and by all indications, the greater part of those who carried it. The version of the War of Gods, or in a less mythological formulation, an armed conflict between two advanced civilizations involving weapons of destructive power, explains all of this simultaneously. It explains the technological level of the construction. It was built by those who possessed that technology. It explains the character of the destruction. It was inflicted by those who possessed weapons of commensurate force. It explains the absence of restoration attempts. There was no one left with the means or the knowledge. And it explains the legends, because legends always speak of what truly occurred, even if the language in which they speak sounds to us like myth. Academic archaeology holds its ground. Puma Punku is a ritual complex of the Tiwanaku culture, built approximately between the 4th and 9th centuries of the Common Era. The destruction is explained by seismic activity characteristic of the Andean region and by centuries of stone quarrying by the local population. The technological anomalies are explained by the skill of the ancient builders who, through the use of abrasive sand, stone tools, and unlimited human labor, achieved results that seem incredible to us only because we underestimate the patience and ingenuity of ancient man. This is the version taught in universities. This is the version that appears in official guidebooks. This is the version cited by UNESCO in its documents on the protection of the site. Let us respect this position, and let us ask a few specific questions. If Puma Punku was destroyed by an earthquake, present the seismic profile corresponding to the observed pattern of destruction. Earthquakes leave characteristic traces, ground fractures, a specific pattern of strata displacement, a recognizable fracture signature in stone structures. Not one of these indicators corresponds to what has been documented at Puma Punku. The ground is buckled upward from below, not cracked horizontally. The blocks are scattered radially from several points, not displaced in a single direction. A monolith stands at 45 degrees, something that never occurs anywhere as a result of seismic activity. This refers to the basic parameters of earthquake damage that any geologist can recite without preparation. Not one of them matches what is observed at the site. If the destruction is partially explained by stone quarrying, explain the character of the remaining damage. Quarrying involves the removal of material. Blocks are carried away, not scattered. A quarry worker is interested in intact blocks of usable size, not in overturned monoliths of several dozen tons, half driven into the ground at an acute angle. Quarrying does not leave traces of thermal vitrification on andesite surfaces. Quarrying does not buckle the ground. This refers to the elementary logic of construction material looting, which is identical across all eras and all cultures. People take what can be carried and used. What cannot be moved, even by modern equipment, is left exactly where it lies. If the precision of the stonework is explained by the abrasive method using sand and stone tools, reproduce this method under controlled conditions. This is a direct and honest challenge. Take a block of andesite. Take abrasive sand and stone instruments. Attempt to cut a rectangular groove with corners at exactly 90 degrees without the slightest rounding. Attempt to drill a hole strictly perpendicular to the surface with a constant diameter along its full depth. Attempt to polish a surface to a mirror finish. Record the time required and compare it with the scale of the entire complex. This experiment has been attempted multiple times, and each time the result has been the same. The abrasive method does not provide the necessary precision, the necessary surface quality, or the reproducibility of result from block to block. This refers to documented attempts in experimental archaeology that official science prefers not to cite in its mainstream publications. If the transportation of blocks weighing between 100 and 440 tons over nearly 90 kilometers is explained by sledges, wooden rollers, and human labor, provide the calculations. Not assumptions, not references to Egyptian experience with blocks tens of times lighter, but specific engineering calculations for this route, this terrain, and this load mass. How many people are required to move a block weighing 440 tons up a mountain slope with a gradient exceeding 10%? What must the cross-sectional area of a wooden roller be to avoid crushing under such a load? What must be the diameter of a plant fiber rope capable of bearing the tensile force required to pull this block up each successive incline? Official science has not published these calculations, because any honest engineering calculation yields the same answer. Using only the technologies that official history allows for this era, the described transportation is physically impossible. The academic position persists not because it is convincing. It persists because it is the default position, the version accepted without proof, precisely because alternative versions require too radical a revision of the entire picture of ancient history. This is not science. It is institutional inertia dressed in scientific authority. The difference between them is fundamental. Science changes its position under the pressure of facts. Institutional inertia changes the facts under the pressure of its position, suppressing inconvenient data, marginalizing inconvenient researchers, and calling inconvenient questions unscientific. In the case of Puma Punku, inconvenient questions have accumulated in sufficient number to fill several monographs, and not one of them has received from official science an answer that would survive elementary engineering scrutiny. This is not a cause for triumph among alternative researchers. It is a cause for a serious conversation that academic tradition has been postponing for decades, and which sooner or later will have to begin. Because the stones of Puma Punku are not going anywhere, and neither are the questions they ask. Assume for a moment that everything stated above is true. Not metaphor, not artistic exaggeration, not conspiratorial fantasy, but literal reality. Puma Punku was a technical installation, a complex designed and built by a civilization that possessed technologies we are only beginning to replicate in the 21st century. A site with modular architecture, standardized components, metal fasteners, and recesses engineered to house equipment of a specific form factor. A site that someone, or something, destroyed through a series of directed strikes with such thoroughness that across the millennia following the catastrophe, no one was able, or willing, to return even a single block to its place. If this is true, then a question arises that matters more than all the previous ones. Not how it was built, not when, not even by whom. The question is different. Why did someone deliver a series of strikes against this installation? What exactly was located here? And what made this place important enough to require destruction with such precision and such force? Begin with what we know for certain. The strike, or series of strikes, was directed. This was not the total obliteration of an area, not a carpet bombardment, not an attempt to erase everything within a radius of several kilometers. Tiwanaku, located 2 kilometers away, survived in considerably better condition. The surrounding territory shows no signs of large-scale destruction comparable to what occurred at Puma Punku itself. This means the target was this specific site, precisely, selectively, deliberately. Someone knew what was here. Someone knew what needed to be destroyed, and someone possessed the means to do it effectively. Now the question of what the H-block recesses contained. The niches are empty. Completely empty, without the slightest trace of anything ever having been housed within them. This is itself an anomaly. Any structure that has stood for millennia accumulates deposits in its cavities. Dust, organic matter, fragments of whatever decayed inside. The recesses of the H-blocks of Puma Punku contain nothing. This refers to two possible explanations, and both are equally unsettling. The first, the contents were removed before or immediately after the catastrophe, either by those who delivered the strike or by those attempting to salvage what could be saved. The second, the contents were destroyed so completely that they left no trace whatsoever, implying either vaporization under extreme temperature or the decomposition of a material that leaves no residue by its nature. Both possibilities say the same thing. Whatever occupied these recesses was either valuable enough or dangerous enough to be taken, or eliminated without remainder. What could have been housed in standardized dimension recesses, in andesite housings, in a complex with modular architecture, situated at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, far from major settlements, but at a strategically significant point, on the watershed between the two largest river systems of South America. Researchers have proposed various versions: an energy installation, a navigation complex, a long-range communication system, a command or observation center. None of these versions is proven, but none of them has been refuted either, because the contents disappeared, and with them disappeared the only direct evidence of what this installation was built to do. It is important to pause here on the geography. Puma Punku is located on the Bolivian Altiplano, one of the highest and most inaccessible plateaus on the planet. Choosing this location for construction requires a compelling reason. Residential complexes are built where there is water, warmth, and arable land. Trade centers are built at the intersection of communication routes. Military installations are built where it is necessary to control territory or hold strategic high ground. Nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, in open terrain, is not a place for living and not a place for commerce. It is a place for an installation that requires isolation, visibility, or particular physical conditions. Thin air, minimal electromagnetic interference, unobstructed horizon visibility across 360 degrees. This refers to conditions that in modern practice are selected for radar stations, astronomical observatories, and long-range communication antenna complexes. And here the open loop closes with full force. If the installation was important enough to build at nearly 4,000 meters, using technologies unavailable to the modern construction industry, what exactly was it doing? What function did it serve? And who made the decision that this function had to be terminated? Immediately, irreversibly, and with a force that left no possibility of restoration? There are no answers to these questions, not because answers are impossible, but because the evidence was destroyed along with the installation. This is the real mystery of Puma Punku, not the construction technology, not the age, not the origin of the builders. The real mystery lies in the motive. Someone very badly wanted this place to cease to exist. Someone succeeded, and someone made certain that we would never know why. Every time you look at Puma Punku, you find yourself thinking about the same thing. Not about antiquity, not about archaeology, but about the fact that what stands before you is a trace not a monument, not a ruin, not a cultural heritage site. A trace. Like the imprint of a hand on glass that someone shattered long ago. You can see the shape of the hand, but you do not know whose it was or why it was raised. The story that the stones of Puma Punku tell does not fit within familiar frameworks. It is not about how ancient people lived. It is not about religion or architecture or trade routes. It is about something larger and far more unsettling, about the fact that somewhere in the depths of the past there existed a civilization that could do what we cannot, that built in stone the way we build in steel, that moved mountains literally, and that is not a metaphor but a physical fact, recorded in tons and kilometers. And that civilization disappeared. It did not gradually dissolve into other cultures, did not slowly degrade under the pressure of climate or disease. It disappeared sharply, completely and forever. So thoroughly that it left behind no successors, no students, not even anyone who knew what exactly had been lost. 3 versions of what happened here exist simultaneously, and none of them fully excludes the others. The first. This was the era before the flood. The very one spoken of in the myths of every people on the planet, without exception. From the Sumerians to the Maya, from the ancient Greeks to the peoples of Polynesia. An era when civilizations existed on Earth about which we know nothing except that they were, and that they were no more. Geologists document the traces of a global catastrophe that occurred approximately 12 to 13,000 years ago. A sharp change in climate, a rise in sea level of hundreds of meters, the disappearance of entire biological species within the span of a few centuries. If Puma Punku was already standing then, and Poznański's data gives grounds to believe so, then its history began in a world that no longer exists. A world from which we are separated not merely by time, but by a catastrophe that erased most of what came before it. The second, this was a war. Not in the metaphorical sense, not the collision of cultures, not the gradual displacement of one tradition by another. War, in the literal sense, an armed conflict between 2 or more parties possessing weapons of destructive power that we cannot precisely assess, but whose consequences we can measure right now. In tons of displaced stone, in degrees of monolith inclination, in the character of the fracture line on an andesite block. This war left physical traces on the Bolivian plateau, as unambiguous as the traces left on a testing range after the detonation of a modern munition. And like any war, it had victors and vanquished. The vanquished, those who built Puma Punku, left no descendants capable of telling us what exactly happened. The victors, whoever they were, either also disappeared or took their knowledge with them. The third. This was the battle of gods. That is precisely what the traditions of the peoples who lived in this region for millennia after the catastrophe call it. Viracocha against the dark forces, celestial beings against earthly adversaries, creators against destroyers. We have become accustomed to reading these myths as fairy tales, and in this lies our error. Because myths are not invention. They are the language in which people without writing and without scientific terminology describe real events. When a tradition speaks of fire from the sky, that is not a poetic image. It is a description of what was witnessed. When a tradition says that the earth trembled and a great city became a pile of stones in a single night, that is not allegory. It is an eyewitness account, recorded in the language of a culture in which the word explosion did not yet exist, but the phenomenon itself had already occurred. all three versions converge at a single point. What happened here was an event of planetary scale. Not the local tragedy of one people, not the accidental destruction of one site, but part of something far larger. Something that simultaneously affected several civilizations on several continents and left its mark in the memory of all humanity. In the form of myths about the flood, about the war of gods, about the golden age that was and is no more. Puma Punku has stood on the Bolivian plateau for millennia, destroyed, scattered, silent. The wind drives dust across its rubble. Tourists photograph the blocks without understanding what they are photographing. Official signs speak of the Tiwanaku culture and ritual traditions. And the stones remain silent, and in that silence there is more information than in all official reports combined. The civilization that built this place disappeared without trace. It left no heirs, no archives, no schools, only stones. Stones worked with a precision we still cannot replicate. Stones scattered with a force we cannot explain. Stones that ask questions to which we have no answers. And until we have those answers, Puma Punku remains what it has always been, the most honest witness to what has already happened to us once before. To us, or to those who came before us, those of whom only these stones remain, and nothing else. If this material made you stop and think, then the stones of Puma Punku have done their job. They have been asking questions for millennia. We are only just beginning to hear them. Leave a like. It is a signal that content like this matters. Not for the algorithm, for the people who have not yet found this channel, but are already looking for exactly this. Subscribe and hit the bell. The next episode is coming soon, and it will carry no fewer questions that official history prefers to leave unanswered. We keep digging. Stay with us.